The porch boards creaked under Thomas Garrett's weight as he settled into the weathered rocking chair that had held him for more evenings than he could count. At 92 years old, his body carried the accumulated wear of nearly a century spent under the New Mexico sun. His hands, gnarled and spotted with age, rested on knees that protested every movement. But his eyes, pale blue and sharp as winter ice, still held the clarity of a man who forgot nothing. Beside him, his great-grandson Daniel shifted in the newer chair Thomas had built last spring. 22 years old, lean and restless, with the nervous energy of youth facing an uncertain future. The boy wore his hair longer than Thomas preferred, but that was the fashion now in 1970. In 3 days, Daniel would board a bus that would take him to basic training and from there to a war in a jungle halfway around the world. The Capitan Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks touched with the last gold of sunset. The same mountains Thomas had watched for 92 years unchanging, while everything else transformed around them. The ranch spread below the porch, 160 acres that had tested every ounce of strength Thomas possessed. Cattle grazed in pastures his grandson William managed. Now the herd descended from stock Thomas had fought to keep almost a century ago. Daniel broke the silence first, as young men often did when silence became uncomfortable. His voice carried the slight tremor of someone trying to appear braver than he felt. "Grandpa Thomas, how did you know about Grandma Eleanor, I mean? You never met her before she stepped off that stagecoach. How did you know she was the right one?" Thomas turned his gaze from the mountains to study his great-grandson. The boy's question held more weight than perhaps he realized. In 3 days, Daniel would leave behind everything familiar. He needed more than platitudes about love and fate. He needed truth, even when truth was uncomfortable. "You want the short answer or the real one?" Thomas asked. Daniel leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "The real one, sir." Thomas nodded slowly. A lifetime of decisions compressed into this moment, this conversation. The sun slipped lower, painting the porch in shades of amber and shadow. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack, the same sounds that had filled these evenings for 9 decades. "Then sit back and listen close," Thomas said. His voice carried the rasp of age, but remained strong, shaped by years of calling cattle across open range. "This is a story about a decision I made in 30 seconds that shaped 50 years of my life, and it starts with a lie." Daniel's eyebrows rose, but he said nothing. "That lie wasn't from your grandmother," Thomas continued, watching the boy's face. "It was from me." The rocking chair stilled. Thomas reached for the memory, as if lifting something fragile and precious from a shelf where it had rested for decades. September 1878. He had been 32 years old, the same age Daniel's father was now. Young enough to believe hard work could overcome any obstacle. Old enough to know better. Cedar Ridge, New Mexico territory existed as little more than a wide spot in the road with aspirations of becoming a proper town. The cavalry post at Fort Stanton brought enough military traffic to support a general store, a saloon, a modest hotel, and a scattering of adobe buildings that housed the hopeful and the desperate in roughly equal measure. Thomas had been standing outside Hendrickson's general store that September afternoon, a sack of flour balanced on his shoulder. The weight pressed down 50 pounds of grain that represented a significant portion of his dwindling resources. He had been calculating in his head, as he did constantly in those days. The flour would last 6 weeks if he was careful, the dried beans another month. The small store of salt pork might stretch through October if he supplemented with hunting. The dust cloud appeared on the western horizon, first a brown smudge against the blue sky that signaled the approach of the westbound stage. Thomas's heart had performed an involuntary lurch, a physical response to an emotion he had forbidden himself to feel for 6 weeks. Ever since he had posted that last letter to Boston, addressed to a woman named Eleanor Bishop, he had lived in a state of suspended anticipation that he refused to acknowledge even to himself. The Concord coach rattled into Cedar Ridge with its usual fanfare. 6 horses in harness, their hides dark with sweat from the long pull across the territory. The driver, a weathered man named Mackenzie, who Thomas knew by sight, if not by friendship, hauled back on the reins and brought the team to a halt outside the hotel. Dust billowed around the wheels, hanging in the still September air, like a curtain waiting to be drawn back. Thomas had found himself rooted to the wooden boardwalk, the flour sack forgotten on his shoulder. Around him, the usual activity of the afternoon continued. A dog barked. Someone laughed inside the saloon. The blacksmith's hammer rang against metal in steady rhythm. But Thomas's entire awareness narrowed to that coach door. He had told himself for 6 weeks that she might not come. The advertisement his cousin had sent from Boston, clipped from a newspaper and forwarded with a brief note encouraging Thomas to take a chance on happiness, had seemed like folly when he first read it. Mail-order brides. The very concept carried a whiff of desperation that Thomas had initially rejected. But the evenings on the ranch stretched long and empty, cooking meals for one man, talking only to horses and cattle, watching the sun set alone night after night until the solitude became less a choice and more a sentence. So he had written a letter, then another, and another, carefully crafting words to present himself as something he was not. In those letters, Thomas Garrett had described himself as a prosperous rancher with 500 head of cattle, a large homestead, and established operation. The lies had flowed easily from his pen because he had convinced himself they were aspirations rather than fabrications. This was who he would become, given time. He was simply describing his future self to this Eleanor Bishop, wherever she might be in Boston. The coach door opened. A gloved hand appeared first, reaching for the frame. Then a woman stepped down onto the dusty street of Cedar Ridge, and Thomas felt the world shift beneath his feet. Eleanor Bishop was not beautiful in the conventional sense that magazine illustrations suggested beauty should manifest. Her traveling dress, a deep navy blue that had once held richness but now showed the wear of long use, had been carefully maintained but could not hide its age. She moved with deliberate grace despite obvious exhaustion, each movement economical and purposeful. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical bun that made no concessions to fashion. Her face held angles rather than curves, all intelligence and determination rather than soft prettiness. But her eyes, even from across the street, arrested Thomas's attention. Hazel, he would learn later, green and gold mixed together like the cottonwood leaves along the creek in autumn. They held wariness and hope in equal measure as they swept across the unfamiliar town. She appeared to be in her mid-20s, though lines around her eyes suggested someone who had smiled often in better times. At this moment, however, her expression carried the guarded uncertainty of a traveler arriving in a foreign land with no guarantee of welcome. Thomas had perhaps 5 seconds to absorb all of this before the second figure emerged from the coach. An elderly woman, thin to the point of frailty, with silver hair escaping from beneath a simple bonnet, accepted Eleanor's offered hand. The old woman moved with obvious difficulty, each step measured and careful. Her breathing was audible even from where Thomas stood. Most telling were her lips, which carried a faint bluish tint that spoke of a heart struggling to perform its essential work. "Mama, careful now," Eleanor said, her voice carrying across the street despite its gentle tone. "We're here. We made it." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. Mama. The letters had never mentioned a mother. Eleanor had written about herself, about her teaching position in Boston that had ended when the school closed, about her hope for a new life. But nowhere in their correspondence had she mentioned traveling with an elderly, obviously ill parent. Thomas's mind, trained by years of ranching to make rapid calculations, began tallying costs without conscious direction. 2 people to feed instead of 1. 2 people requiring shelter clothing care. The woman's condition meant potential medical expenses, and doctors in the territory charged fees that reflected the scarcity of their services. Eleanor would need to devote time to caring for her mother, which meant less help with the ranch work he had implied she would assist with. The mathematics were brutal and immediate. Thomas was 32 years old in debt, $340 to the Cedar Ridge Bank, with a foreclosure notice that gave him 6 months to pay in full or lose everything. His large homestead consisted of a 2-room adobe cabin with a leaking thatched roof. His 500 head of cattle numbered 47, and that count included calves too young to sell, and 3 aging cows he kept out of sentiment rather than economic sense. He could not afford to take in 1 person, let alone 2. The rational decision was clear. Walk across the street, apologize politely, but firmly explain that there had been a misunderstanding, wish them well, and arrange for their lodging at the hotel for 1 night before they caught tomorrow's eastbound stage back to their previous life. The station manager, a rotund man named Clyde, who made everyone's business his own, was already approaching the 2 women. Thomas could not hear the exchange from where he stood, but body language told the story clearly enough. Clyde was shaking his head. Eleanor's shoulders had gone rigid, her chin lifting in that universal gesture of defensive pride that Thomas recognized instantly because he had worn the same expression countless times. She was explaining something, asking about lodging most likely. And Clyde was informing her that the hotel was full, or perhaps suggesting that accommodations might be difficult to arrange for two unaccompanied women without funds or references. Thomas watched the old woman sway slightly, Eleanor's hand immediately moving to steady her. The carpet bags that the driver tossed down from the coach roof landed in the dust with soft thuds that spoke of minimal contents. Everything they owned in the world, Thomas realized, could fit in two bags in a small trunk. They were desperate. The urgency Eleanor had mentioned in her last letter, the note about circumstances requiring us to leave sooner than planned, had not been exaggeration. They had fled Boston with whatever they could carry, betting everything on a man they had never met based on letters that painted a picture of security and stability, based on lies. Thomas set the flour sack down by the general store's door. His hands moved of their own accord, his body responding to a decision his conscious mind had not yet fully articulated. His boots kicked up small puffs of dust with each step as he crossed the street. He was aware of curious eyes following his progress. Cedar Ridge was small enough that any unusual occurrence drew attention, and the arrival of two Eastern women would fuel conversation for weeks. The sun pressed down on his shoulders. Sweat traced a line down his spine beneath his work shirt. With each step, the enormity of what he was about to do became clearer, but his feet continued carrying him forward. Clyde saw him approaching and stepped back with visible relief. Whatever difficulty the women presented, it was now someone else's problem. Thomas removed his hat, an automatic gesture drilled into him by his mother before she died. "Excuse me, Miss Bishop." Eleanor turned, and up close her eyes were even more striking. They studied him with an assessing gaze that missed nothing, taking in his work. Worn clothes, his sun-weathered face, his calloused hands. Intelligence shone in those eyes, along with wariness, born of necessity, and disappointment, born of experience. "Yes," she said, her voice carrying the educated tones of someone who had taught school. "I'm Eleanor Bishop. Are you Mr. Garrett?" "Thomas Garrett, yes, ma'am." He turned his attention to the elderly woman who was leaning heavily on her daughter's arm. Despite her obvious frailty, her eyes remained sharp and evaluating. "And you must be Mrs. Bishop. I'm pleased to meet you both." The old woman's faded blue eyes fixed on him with an intensity that belied her weakened state. "Martha Bishop," she said, her voice thin but steady. "I apologize for the surprise, Mr. Garrett. Eleanor wrote to tell you, but I suppose the letter didn't arrive before we had to leave Boston." The admission hung in the air between them. Before we had to leave. Not decided to leave, but had to leave. Whatever had driven them from Boston had been urgent enough that they could not wait for Thomas's response to a letter he had never received. That spoke of desperation, possibly danger, certainly circumstances beyond normal hardship. Thomas processed this information, filing it away for later consideration. No letter arrived, he confirmed, keeping his voice neutral and kind. His mind was still calculating, still tallying the impossible mathematics of what he was about to commit to. But that doesn't change anything important. He took a breath, and in that breath lived the space where he could still turn back, still make the rational choice, still protect himself from what was certainly going to be financial catastrophe. "My home has room for both of you," Thomas said, "if you're still willing to consider the arrangement we discussed." The relief that flooded Eleanor's face was so profound that Thomas felt something shift in his chest. She had been braced for rejection, had probably rehearsed a dozen different speeches defending her choice to bring her mother, had steeled herself for the moment when this stranger would turn his back on her need. That he did not immediately send them away seemed to catch her completely off guard. Her hand tightened on her mother's arm, whether for support or reassurance Thomas could not tell. "You mean that?" Eleanor asked, and there was a tremor in her voice that she could not quite hide. "We wouldn't be an imposition, Mr. Garrett. I can work, I can cook and clean, and help with whatever needs doing. Mama can mend and sew, despite her hands not being as steady as they once were. We'll earn our keep. I'm sure you'll both be valuable additions to the household," Thomas said, and found that he meant it despite the chaos this would certainly bring to his carefully managed desperation. "But first, let's get you settled and fed. You must be exhausted from the journey." Clyde, who had been watching this exchange with undisguised interest, cleared his throat. "You planning to marry right away?" Then Thomas Reverend Morris is out visiting the Henderson Ranch, but he'll be back tomorrow. Thomas saw Eleanor's cheeks flush, saw the way Martha's eyes narrowed slightly at the station manager's presumptuousness. That's a discussion for later, Thomas said firmly, his tone brooking no argument. Right now, these ladies need rest and a proper meal. I'll take them out to the ranch. He collected their bags before either woman could protest. The trunk was surprisingly light when he lifted it, confirming his earlier assessment. Everything they owned reduced to this. The weight of their trust in him, a complete stranger, settled over Thomas's shoulders with far more heft than any physical burden. His wagon was hitched outside the saloon, where he had stopped earlier to deliver a message to one of his ranch hands. As they walked the short distance, Thomas found himself acutely aware of the picture they must present. Him with his worn work clothes and sun-weathered face leading two Boston women through the dusty streets of a frontier town that probably seemed primitive beyond belief to them. Yet neither woman complained or commented. They walked with dignity, despite their obvious exhaustion, and Thomas appreciated their discretion more than he could articulate. He helped Martha into the wagon first, noting how she struggled to lift her legs high enough to manage the step. Eleanor climbed up with more ease, settling beside her mother and immediately arranging their skirts to protect against the dust. It's about 5 miles to the ranch, Thomas explained as he took a seat and picked up the reins. The road's rough in places, but I'll do my best to avoid the worst of it. There's water in the canteen under the seat if you need it. Thank you, Eleanor said. You're very kind, Mr. Garrett. More than we had any right to expect. As Thomas guided the horses out of Cedar Ridge, he considered how to respond. The truth was that kindness had little to do with his decision. Loneliness, perhaps. Recognition of shared desperation, certainly. But kindness implied a generosity of spirit that Thomas did not feel at this moment. He felt trapped by circumstances of his own making, committed to a course of action that reason condemned but something deeper than reason demanded. I put an advertisement in that newspaper looking for a partner, Thomas said finally. Someone to build a life with. The circumstances aren't exactly what either of us anticipated, but the fundamental truth remains the same. I need someone, and you need somewhere to be. Seems to me we can help each other. Martha made a small sound that might have been approval. Eleanor's hand found her mother's and squeezed. Thomas kept his eyes on the road, giving them a moment of privacy despite the close quarters. The landscape around Cedar Ridge was harsh and beautiful in equal measure. The Capitan Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks already touched with the first hints of autumn snow. The valley spread between in shades of brown and gold and dotted with pinyon and juniper trees that somehow thrived in the arid soil. Thomas loved this land with a fierceness that sometimes surprised him. Loved its honesty and its challenges. It demanded everything from those who tried to make a life here, but it gave back in ways that were harder to quantify. Freedom, space, the chance to be who you truly were without the weight of society's expectations pressing down. It's very different from Boston, Eleanor observed, and Thomas could not tell if that was complaint or simply statement of fact. It is, he agreed. Takes some getting used to, but there's beauty here if you look for it. The sunsets are like nothing you've ever seen. And in spring, when the wildflowers bloom, the whole valley turns colors that don't seem real. I like it, Martha said unexpectedly, her thin voice carrying conviction. It feels like a place where a person could start over, where the past doesn't matter as much as what you do today. Thomas glanced at her, caught by the wistfulness in her tone. There was a story there, he sensed, layers of history that had brought these two women to his doorstep. But stories could wait. Right now, what mattered was getting them home and making them feel safe. The ranch house came into view as they crested a small rise, and Thomas tried to see it through their eyes. It was not much, just a simple structure of adobe and wood with a covered porch that wrapped around two sides. He had built it himself 7 years ago when he first claimed this land, adding to it gradually as his herd grew and his resources allowed. There was a barn more accurately described as a 3-sided shelter that protected against winter storms. A chicken coop housed 4 scrawny hens that laid eggs with irregular enthusiasm. A small bunkhouse, barely more than a shed, provided sleeping quarters for the ranch hand he could occasionally afford to employ. A corral held 2 horses and the visible portion of his cattle herd. Thomas watched Eleanor's face as she took it in, saw her eyes widen slightly, not with appreciation or pleasant surprise, with something closer to shock quickly masked but unmistakable. This was not the large homestead his letters had described. This was a hardscrabble operation held together with spit and determination, one bad season away from complete failure. "Home," Thomas said, simply pulling the wagon to a stop in front of the house. He helped both women down again, noting how unsteady Martha was on her feet. Inside the house was clean but Spartan, furnished with pieces Thomas had made himself or acquired through trades in town. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, dominated by a large fireplace that would be essential when winter came. Two doorways opened off the main space. Thomas set their bags down by the door. "I know it's not fancy, but it's solid and warm and dry. You'll have the bedroom on the right. I'll move my things out to the bunkhouse tonight." "Absolutely not," Eleanor said firmly, the first spark of fire showing in her demeanor. "We cannot displace you from your own room, Mr. Garrett. Mama and I will be perfectly comfortable in the smaller room. We've shared quarters before." Thomas started to argue, then saw the set of her jaw and recognized that this was important to her. Pride was sometimes all a person had left, and he would not take that from her. "The smaller room, then," he conceded. "But if you change your minds, the offer stands. Now let me get a fire started and put some coffee on. I have stew from yesterday that I can heat up and bread that's only a day old." He busied himself with these tasks, aware that both women were taking in their surroundings with careful attention. The house reflected his bachelor existence in ways that were probably obvious to anyone with experience running a household. Everything was functional but minimal, lacking the touches that made a house a home. No curtains on the windows, no rugs on the floor, no decorations or softness anywhere. Eleanor seemed to come to some internal decision. She removed her traveling jacket and hung it on one of the pegs by the door, then rolled up her sleeves in a businesslike manner. "Let me help," she said. "Where do you keep your plates and utensils?" "You don't need to do that," Thomas protested. "You just arrived. You should rest." "I've been sitting for days," Eleanor countered. "I'd rather be useful. Please, Mr. Garrett, let me help." They worked together in the kitchen area, and Thomas found himself hyper-aware of her presence in his space. She moved with efficiency, asking questions about where things were stored and nodding when he explained his rudimentary system of organization. Within 30 minutes, the small table was set and the stew was warming over the fire, filling the house with savory aromas that made Thomas realize how hungry he was. Martha had settled into the chair closest to the fireplace. Thomas noticed that she was shivering slightly despite the warmth of the day. He grabbed a blanket from his room, the only extra blanket he owned, and draped it over her shoulders without comment. The grateful smile Eleanor gave him carried more warmth than any words could have conveyed. They ate together as the sun set outside, painting the sky in those brilliant shades Thomas had promised. The portions were small. Thomas had divided the stew meant for one person across 3 bowls, adding water and more beans to stretch it. The beans were undercooked and would be crunchy, but they would fill bellies. The bread was hard, but it softened when dipped in the thin broth. Thomas gave the women larger portions and took the smallest for himself. They noticed but did not comment, which he appreciated. The conversation was stilted, at first all of them aware that they were essentially strangers thrust into an intimate situation. But gradually, as hunger was satisfied and the warmth of fire and food worked their magic, the tension began to ease. Thomas learned that Martha had been a seamstress in Boston, that her husband had died 15 years earlier when cargo being unloaded at the docks had shifted and crushed him. Eleanor had been teaching at a small school for girls from poor families, a charity institution that relied on donations to operate. When their primary benefactor died suddenly, and his heirs chose not to continue his philanthropy, the school had closed with only a week's notice. "I was living in a boarding house," Eleanor said quietly, her eyes on her mother's face, "saving every penny in hopes of eventually having enough to open my own school. But the loss of income made that impossible. And then Mama became ill. The doctor said she needed rest and fresh air," Eleanor continued, "things that are impossible to find in the city when you have no money. I saw your cousin's advertisement in a newspaper someone had left at the boarding house. It seemed like Providence, a chance for both of us to start over." "So you wrote to me," Thomas said, understanding now the desperation that had driven her. "I wrote to you," Eleanor confirmed, "and you wrote back. Your letters were kind, Mr. Garrett. You seemed like a good man, someone who understood what it meant to work hard and to value honesty." The word honesty sat between them like an accusation, though Eleanor could not have known how it would land. Thomas felt the weight of his deceptions pressing down. She thought she had come to a prosperous ranch. She believed she had chosen a man of substance and security. She trusted him based on lies he had carefully crafted. "I know this isn't what you signed on for," Eleanor said, misreading his silence. "Bringing both of us. If you want us to leave, if this is too much, I'll understand. We can go back to town tomorrow. I'll find some kind of work there." Thomas set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. This was the moment. He could tell her the truth, confess that he had lied about the cattle, about the prosperity, about the established operation. Explain about the debt in the foreclosure. Give her the choice to leave before she became more entangled in his failing enterprise. "Miss Bishop," Thomas said instead, "I meant what I said earlier. My home has room for both of you. I'm not going to turn you away because circumstances are more complicated than I expected. Life is always more complicated than we expect. What matters is how we handle it." Martha spoke up, then her voice stronger than it had been earlier. "You're a good man, Mr. Garrett. I can see why my daughter chose you. But I want you to know that I don't intend to be a burden. I can still sew and mend, even if my body doesn't cooperate the way it used to. And I won't stand in the way of whatever arrangement you and Eleanor come to." "Mama," Eleanor said, mortified, but Thomas held up a hand. "Mrs. Bishop, you're not a burden. As for marriage," he looked at Eleanor, saw the uncertainty and hope warring in her expression. "That's something Miss Bishop and I need to discuss when we've both had time to think. There's no rush. We'll figure out what works." Later, after the women had retired to their room and Thomas had moved his essential belongings to the bunkhouse, he stood on the porch and looked up at the stars. The night was clear and cool. He could hear the cattle lowing in the distance and the yip of coyotes on the far ridge. This was his life, the one he had built through years of hard work and determination. And now, in the span of a few hours, it had been turned upside down by the arrival of two women who brought with them complications and responsibilities he had not fully anticipated. But as he stood there in the darkness, Thomas did not feel regret. Instead, he felt something that might have been hope. The house had felt less empty tonight, warmed by more than just the fire in the hearth. There had been conversation and connection, the kind of human contact he had been missing without fully realizing it. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. There would be practical matters to sort out, decisions to make about sleeping arrangements and work divisions, and the question of marriage that hung between him and Eleanor like morning mist. But tonight, Thomas allowed himself to simply feel grateful that they had come, that they had trusted him enough to make this journey. Inside the house, Eleanor helped her mother change into a nightgown and get settled into the narrow bed that took up most of the smaller room. There was barely space for a second person to sleep on the floor, but Eleanor had spread blankets there and made herself as comfortable as possible. It was no worse than some of the accommodations they had endured on the journey west, and far better than the alternatives they had faced in Boston. "He's not what I expected," Martha said softly in the darkness. "What did you expect?" Eleanor asked, though she knew what her mother meant. Thomas was not the grizzled, rough character she had feared might answer a mail-order bride advertisement. He was weathered by sun and work, yes, but there was kindness in his eyes and a gentleness in the way he moved that spoke of a man who was deliberate in his actions. "I don't know," Martha admitted. "Someone harder, perhaps, more desperate. But Mr. Garrett seems like a man who chose to seek a wife, not someone who had no other options. That speaks well of him." Eleanor thought about this as she lay in the darkness, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch. Her mother was right. Thomas could have reacted with anger or resentment when he realized she had brought an additional person into their arrangement. Many men would have. Instead, he had responded with grace and acceptance, had made room in his home and his life without hesitation. She found herself remembering the way his hands had looked as he helped her mother from the wagon. Strong and capable, but infinitely careful. The way he had draped the blanket over Martha's shoulders without making a fuss about it, as if caring for others was simply what one did. In Boston, Eleanor had known men who performed charity like it was a performance, who wanted recognition for every small kindness. Thomas's generosity seemed to come from a different place entirely, something fundamental to his character, rather than something he did for show. "Do you think you could love him?" Martha asked, and Eleanor was glad for the darkness that hid her blush. "I don't know him well enough to answer that," Eleanor said honestly. but I think I could respect him. And perhaps that's a better foundation for a marriage than romantic notions. Perhaps, Martha agreed, though she sounded doubtful. But you deserve romance too, my dear. You deserve to be loved, not just respected. Eleanor did not answer, but she found herself hoping that her mother was right. That maybe in this harsh and beautiful land, she might find both respect and love. That the arrangement that had begun as a practical solution to desperate circumstances might become something more. The next days fell into a rhythm that surprised all of them with its naturalness. Thomas rose before dawn, as was his habit, and headed out to tend the cattle and horses. Eleanor woke shortly after stoking the fire and preparing breakfast with the supplies Thomas had on hand. When he returned, they ate together, the conversation gradually becoming less stilted as they learned each other's patterns and preferences. Martha stayed inside for the most part, her strength not equal to the demands of ranch life, but she kept herself occupied with mending and sewing. Thomas's clothes bore testament to years of bachelor repairs, seams splitting and buttons missing, and patches applied with more determination than skill. She took obvious pleasure in fixing what he had neglected, her professional seamstress eye recognizing quality fabric beneath the damage. Eleanor helped with the heavier chores, learning to feed the chickens and collect their meager offerings of eggs, to draw water from the well 50 yards from the house, to hang laundry on the line Thomas strung up between two posts. The work was harder than anything she had done in Boston, but there was satisfaction in it, a directness that teaching had never quite provided. On the third day, Thomas rode into Cedar Ridge and returned with fabric thread and a Singer sewing machine that he carried in on his shoulder despite Eleanor's protests that it was too much. "I've been meaning to get one anyway," he said, though Eleanor suspected this was not entirely true. "Figured it would make Mrs. Bishop's work easier." Martha's eyes had filled with tears when she saw the machine, running her hands over its smooth surface with something like reverence. "I haven't had access to a machine since I lost my position at the shop," she said quietly. "This is too generous, Mr. Garrett." "It's an investment," Thomas replied gruffly, embarrassed by her emotion. "You can do repairs for folks in town if you want. Extra income for you both." This practical framing seemed to make the gift more acceptable to Martha's pride, and she nodded, wiping her eyes. Within days, word had spread through Cedar Ridge that there was a skilled seamstress at the Garrett Ranch, and people began bringing work. Martha's face regained some of its color as she bent over the machine, her fingers remembering old skills and finding purpose again. Eleanor watched the transformation in her mother with gratitude that went beyond words. In Boston, Martha had been fading, worn down by poverty and illness and the grinding hopelessness of their situation. Here she was coming back to life in small but measurable ways. As for her own role, Eleanor was still figuring out where she fit. She was not Thomas's wife, not technically, though they lived under the same roof and shared meals and conversation. The question of marriage hung between them, unspoken but present in every interaction. Thomas had not pressed the matter, had not demanded an answer or set a timeline. Eleanor appreciated his patience, but she also felt the weight of uncertainty. What were they building here? What did he expect from her? The answer began to reveal itself in increments. Thomas was teaching her about the ranch, explaining the cattle business and the challenges of making a living from this hard land. He showed her how to ride one of the gentler horses, steadying her when she wobbled in the saddle and praising her when she managed a complete circuit of the corral without assistance. He consulted her about practical matters, asking her opinion on everything from what supplies to buy in town to where to plant a vegetable garden come spring. He treated her, Eleanor realized, like a partner, not like a servant or an obligation, but like someone whose thoughts and contributions mattered. It was a novel experience for a woman who had spent most of her adult life being told what to do and how to do it. 2 weeks after her arrival, Eleanor was working in the kitchen when Thomas came in from the fields earlier than usual. His shirt was dusty and his hair was disheveled, and there was something in his expression that made her set down the spoon she had been using to stir stew. "Is everything all right?" she asked. Thomas removed his hat and turned it in his hands, a gesture she had come to recognize as a sign that he was working up to saying something difficult. "I need to talk to you about something," he said. "About us." Eleanor's heart began to beat faster. She glanced toward the bedroom where Martha was napping, grateful for the relative privacy. "All right," she said, wiping her hands on her apron and sitting down at the table. Thomas sat across from her, and for a moment he just looked at her in a way that made her feel seen down to her bones. "I've been thinking about our arrangement," he began, "about what makes sense for everyone involved, and I think we need to be honest with each other about what we want this to be." "I agree," Eleanor said, though her voice came out smaller than she intended. "When I put that advertisement in the paper, I was looking for a wife," Thomas continued. "Not just someone to cook and clean, but a true partner. Someone to build a life with. To share the good and the bad. Someone to talk to in the evenings and wake up next to in the mornings. Maybe eventually someone to raise children with." Eleanor nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "But I also know that wanting something and having it just happen are two different things," Thomas said. "You came here out of necessity, not because you knew me and chose me. And you have your mother to think about. Responsibilities that go beyond just your own happiness. I don't want you to feel pressured into anything." He paused, meeting her eyes directly. "If you'd rather keep things as they are, you living here and helping with the ranch, but us staying separate, I can accept that. You and your mother will have a home here regardless. That's my promise to you." The generosity of this offer, the sheer decency of it, made Eleanor's eyes burn with unshed tears. How many men would make such a promise? How many would be content with an arrangement that gave them all the responsibility of housing and feeding two women without any of the traditional benefits of marriage? "What do you want?" Eleanor asked, needing to hear him say it clearly. Thomas's answer came without hesitation. "I want to court you properly. I want us to take the time to get to know each other without the pressure of expectations hanging over us. And if at the end of that time you think you could be happy as my wife, then I would be honored to marry you. But if not, the offer of a home still stands." Eleanor felt something unfurl in her chest, something warm and bright that she had not allowed herself to feel in years. Hope. Real, genuine hope for a future that might hold not just security, but happiness. "I would like that," she said softly. "I would like to be courted, Mr. Garrett, to get to know you better. You've been nothing but kind and generous since we arrived. But you're right that we're still strangers in many ways. I want to change that." The smile that spread across Thomas's face transformed him, making him look younger and lighter, as if he had been carrying a burden that he could finally set down. "Then that's what we'll do," he said. "And Eleanor, maybe you could call me Thomas. I think we're past the point of such formality." "Thomas," she repeated, testing the name on her tongue, feeling how it fit in her mouth. "And you should call me Eleanor." "Eleanor," he said, and the way he said her name like it was something precious that he was honored to speak made her blush despite herself. The courtship that followed was unlike anything Eleanor had experienced in her 26 years. In Boston, social conventions had dictated strict protocols. Young men called at appointed hours, conversations occurred in parlors with chaperones present, and every interaction followed prescribed rules designed to maintain propriety and protect reputations. Here in the New Mexico territory, such formalities seemed not just unnecessary, but absurd. There were no parlors to receive visitors, no scheduled calling hours, no chaperones beyond Martha, who made herself deliberately scarce. Instead, there were long rides across the ranch with Thomas pointing out landmarks and explaining the rhythms of the land. There were evenings on the porch, watching sunsets that painted the sky in colors Eleanor had never imagined possible. There were conversations that ranged from practical discussions about cattle management to philosophical debates about education and social reform. Thomas proved to be a better conversationalist than his letters had suggested. He listened more than he spoke, asking questions that revealed genuine interest rather than polite obligation. When he did speak, his words carried weight because they were chosen carefully rather than scattered carelessly. On their first ride together, Thomas took Eleanor to the western boundary of his property, where a creek ran through a stand of cottonwood trees. The water flowed clear and cold, fed by snowmelt from the Capitan Mountains. Thomas helped Eleanor dismount, then led her to a flat rock beside the water where they could sit and rest. "This is my favorite spot on the whole ranch," Thomas said, settling beside her but maintaining a respectful distance. "When I first came here 7 years ago and filed the homestead claim, this creek was the reason I chose this particular section. Water is life out here, Eleanor. A ranch without reliable water is just land waiting to turn to dust." Eleanor watched the water flow over smooth stones, creating patterns of light and shadow. "How did you end up in New Mexico?" she asked. "Your letters mentioned Kansas, but not much about why you left." Thomas was quiet for a moment, his eyes on the distant mountains. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old pain carefully stored away. My father was a farmer in Kansas, worked land that had been in his family for 2 generations. He was good at farming when he was sober, which wasn't often enough. My mother tried to make up the difference, working twice as hard to compensate for his drinking. She died of pneumonia when I was 15, but I think it was really exhaustion and a broken spirit that killed her. Eleanor reached out instinctively, her hand finding his on the rock between them. Thomas looked down at their joined hands as if surprised by the contact, but he did not pull away. I stayed another year trying to keep the farm going. But my father's drinking got worse without my mother there to manage it. By the time I was 16, I realized that if I stayed, I would end up just like him, angry and drunk and watching everything slip away. So I left with $8 and the clothes I was wearing. That must have been terrifying, Eleanor said softly. It was, Thomas admitted. But it was also freeing. I worked as a ranch hand for 6 years, moving from Kansas to Colorado to Texas. I saved every penny I could, learned everything I could about cattle and horses and survival. When I was 22, I had enough saved to file a homestead claim. I came to New Mexico because the land was still available and because I wanted to be somewhere my father's reputation couldn't follow me. He turned to look at her directly. I came here to build something that mattered, something that would last. A place where a man's word meant something and his work spoke louder than his name. Eleanor heard the conviction in his voice and understood something fundamental about the man beside her. Thomas had not just been seeking land or prosperity. He had been seeking redemption from a family legacy of failure. Everything he built here was an argument against the life his father had shown him. Your letter spoke about honesty being the measure of a man's character, Eleanor said, remembering the phrases that had convinced her he was worth the risk of coming west. I believe that, Thomas said firmly. A man's word is everything out here. If people can't trust what you say, you might as well be dead. Reputation takes years to build and one lie to destroy. The irony of these words would haunt Thomas later when Eleanor discovered the truth about his circumstances. But in that moment, sitting beside the creek with her hand in his, he believed what he was saying even as he continued to hide the debt that threatened everything. Eleanor shared her own history over the course of several conversations. Her father had been a scholar teaching at a private academy in Boston until his progressive views on education and social reform had cost him his position. He had believed that all children, regardless of class or gender, deserved quality education. He had written articles arguing for public schools and universal literacy. These positions, considered radical by Boston society, had made him unemployable at reputable institutions. He taught private lessons after he lost his position, Eleanor explained during an evening on the porch. But it was never enough. We went from comfortable to struggling to desperately poor over the course of 5 years. He died when I was 19. The doctor said it was his heart, but I think it was disappointment. He had wanted to change the world and ended up unable to even support his family. But you became a teacher, Thomas observed. You followed his vision even after seeing what it cost him. I couldn't not follow it, Eleanor said. His ideas were right, Thomas. Every child deserves to learn. Education is the only real path out of poverty. I saw it every day at the charity school. Girls who came to us barely able to read would leave that able to pursue work as clerks or secretaries instead of factory workers or worse. We changed lives. Until the money ran out, Thomas said. Until the money ran out, Eleanor agreed, her voice bitter with the memory. Mr. Cartwright was our benefactor. He believed in our work. But when he died, his son saw the school as just another expense to eliminate. They closed us with a week's notice and no consideration for the 100 girls we were teaching or the dozen women we employed. Thomas heard the anger beneath her words and recognized it as the same anger he had felt when injustice struck. They were both fighters, he realized. Both stubborn believers in principles that the world often punished rather than rewarded. You could teach here, Thomas said. There are families in the territory who would pay for quality instruction. Not much maybe, but something. Eleanor's face lit up with an enthusiasm he had not yet seen. Do you really think so? I hadn't dared hope that there might be opportunities here. Cedar Ridge needs a teacher, Thomas said. Right now, children who want education have to ride 15 miles to Fort Stanton, and most families can't spare the time or the horse. If you offered instruction closer by, I think you'd have students. The possibility seemed to energize Eleanor in a way that ranch work for all her willing effort had not. She began asking questions about the community, about how many families with children lived within riding distance, about what subjects would be most useful. Thomas answered as best he could, watching her transform from the wary, exhausted woman who had stepped off the stagecoach into someone animated by purpose and possibility. As October arrived and the air turned crisp with the first hints of winter, Thomas felt the courtship deepening into something more substantial than friendly companionship. He found himself thinking about Eleanor during the day when he should have been focused on cattle. He caught himself watching for her smile, listening for her laugh, noticing the small ways she had already changed his home. Curtains now hung in the windows sewn by Martha from fabric Eleanor had bartered for by trading eggs and garden vegetables. Rugs that Martha had woven from scraps covered the bare floor. The house smelled of baking bread and the herbs Eleanor had dried and hung in the kitchen. Small changes, but they transformed the space from a place Thomas slept in to something that felt like a home. Martha observed their growing attachment with satisfaction, but said little. Her health had improved markedly in the dry climate. The bluish tint had faded from her lips, and she no longer needed to rest after every small exertion. She worked at the Singer machine for hours each day, building a reputation in Cedar Ridge for quality work at fair prices. One evening in mid-October, Thomas took Eleanor to the highest point on his property, a rocky outcrop he called the Overlook. The view stretched for miles in every direction. The valley spread below, like a patchwork quilt of browns and golds in the deep green of juniper. They sat on a flat rock while their horses grazed nearby and watched as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. Thomas had brought a blanket, and he draped it over Eleanor's shoulders as the temperature dropped. His hands lingered perhaps a moment longer than strictly necessary, and he felt her lean slightly into his touch before he pulled away. "I love it here," Eleanor said, her voice soft with wonder. "When I first arrived, this landscape seemed so harsh, so alien and unforgiving. But it's revealed its beauty to me in countless small ways. The resilience of the plants that thrive in difficult soil, the vast expanse of sky that makes me feel simultaneously tiny and part of something infinite, the silence that isn't empty but full of wind and bird song, and the subtle sounds of life persisting against odds." "I'm glad," Thomas said, and meant it more deeply than she could know. "Because I've been thinking, Eleanor, and I need to ask you something important." She turned to look at him, and in the golden light of the setting sun, her hazel eyes held depths that drew him in. Her face showed intelligence and strength and something else he was only beginning to recognize. Trust. She trusted him, this woman who had every reason to be wary of trusting anyone. The knowledge of her trust made what he had to say both easier and infinitely harder. "We've been dancing around this for weeks now," Thomas continued, "getting to know each other, building something between us. And I think you know how I feel about you, Eleanor. But I need to say it out loud because you deserve to hear it spoken plainly." He took a breath, aware that what he said next would change everything between them. "I've fallen in love with you. Not because you're convenient or because you're here, not because I needed someone and you needed somewhere, but because of who you are, your strength and your kindness, the way you see possibilities where others see only obstacles. I love the way you treat your mother, the way you've taken to ranch life, even though it's nothing like what you're used to. I love talking with you and working beside you and imagining a future where we do this for the rest of our lives." Eleanor's eyes had filled with tears that caught the sunset light. She made no move to wipe them away. "So I'm asking you properly and formally," Thomas said. "Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife, not because of some arrangement made through letters, not out of desperation or convenience, but because we've chosen each other, because we want to build a life together?" For a moment, Eleanor could not speak. The tears spilled over, tracking down her cheeks. Then she laughed, the sound catching between joy and emotion. "Yes," she said, the word coming out as half laugh, half sob. "Yes, Thomas, I'll marry you because I've fallen in love with you too, with your patience and in your generosity. The way you made room in your life for both me and my mother without hesitation. The way you see value in things others overlook. Your quiet strength and your terrible jokes, and the way you look at me like I'm something precious." Thomas pulled her into his arms, and Eleanor came willingly, fitting against him, as if she had always belonged there. When he kissed her, it was gentle at first, almost questioning, seeking permission even though she had already given it. Then deeper as she responded, her hands coming up to frame his face. It was a kiss full of promise and passion and the sweet relief of two people who had found each other against impossible odds. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing harder, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. "I promise you," he said quietly, "I will spend every day trying to be worthy of your trust." The words were sincere, spoken from his heart, but they also carried the weight of his unspoken deceptions. The debt he had not mentioned, the foreclosure he had not disclosed, the lies that formed the foundation of everything they were building together. They rode back to the ranch as stars began to appear in the darkening sky, hand in hand their horses walking side by side. When they entered the house, Martha took one look at their faces and smiled knowingly. "About time," she said, setting down her sewing. "I was beginning to think you two would never get around to it." Thomas laughed, a sound of pure joy that Eleanor had never heard from him before. "We'll marry as soon as it can be arranged, and that meets with your approval, Mrs. Bishop." "My approval was given the day you met us at that stagecoach and didn't turn us away," Martha said firmly. "You're a good man, Thomas Garrett. My daughter is lucky to have you, though I suspect you're pretty lucky too." "The luckiest man alive," Thomas agreed, looking at Eleanor with such open affection that she felt warmth spread through her chest. They set the wedding for 3 weeks hence, time enough for Martha to sew Eleanor a proper dress and for Thomas to purchase new clothes and arrange with the Reverend Morris to perform the ceremony. Word spread quickly through Cedar Ridge. The mail-order bride and the solitary rancher would be married. Curiosity and goodwill mixed in equal measure as the small community prepared to witness the union. But as the days passed and the wedding approached, Thomas felt the weight of his secrets growing heavier. Each time Eleanor talked about their future together, each time she made plans that assumed security and stability, he felt the lies pressing down on his chest like stones. He told himself he would confess after the wedding. Once they were legally bound, once she could not easily leave, then he would tell her about the debt and they would face it together. It was cowardice masquerading as strategy, and some part of Thomas knew it even as he continued down that path. 2 weeks before the wedding, Jack Crawford pulled Thomas aside while they were working in the barn. Jack was 58 years old, weathered by decades of ranch work, his left leg stiff from an old injury that left him with a permanent limp. He had been working for Thomas on and off for 3 years, and he was the closest thing Thomas had to a friend. "Boss, I got to say something," Jack began, his lined face serious. "And you ain't gonna like it." "Then maybe don't say it," Thomas replied, not looking up from the bridle he was mending. "You're making a mistake," Jack said bluntly. "Marrying this woman without telling her the truth about the debt, about the foreclosure, that ain't right." Thomas's hands stilled on the leather. "I'll handle it." "How?" Jack demanded. "You got 4 months. In 4 months, if you don't pay $340, the bank takes everything. This ranch, this house, everything. And then what? You got a wife and a sick mother-in-law and no home." "You thought about that?" "Every damn day," Thomas said quietly. "Then tell her," Jack insisted. "Give her the choice. Maybe she's got family back east. Maybe they got money. Maybe there's a solution you can't see. But marrying her under false pretenses, boss, that ain't the man I know you to be." Thomas finally looked up, meeting Jack's eyes. "I said I'll handle it, Jack." The older man shook his head, disappointment clear on his face. "I hope you do, boss, because if you don't, you'll lose more than this ranch. You'll lose her respect, and that's worse than losing land." Jack's words haunted Thomas over the next 2 weeks, but he did not change course. He told himself he was protecting Eleanor from worry. That once they were married, her stake in the ranch's success would be as great as his, and they could work together to solve the problem. That honesty could wait until after the wedding. These were the lies he told himself to justify the lies he had already told. The wedding took place on a crisp November morning in the small church at Cedar Ridge. Eleanor wore a dress that Martha had labored over for weeks, pale blue fabric with delicate embroidery that had taken hours to complete. The color brought out the green in her hazel eyes and made her skin seem to glow. Thomas wore new clothes purchased specifically for the occasion, a dark suit that felt stiff and uncomfortable but made him look, Eleanor thought, devastatingly handsome. The entire town turned out, filling the small church to capacity. Curiosity had brought many of them the desire to see the mail-order bride, who had arrived with her elderly mother and somehow captured the heart of one of the territory's most eligible bachelors. But there was genuine goodwill, too, a community coming together to celebrate a beginning. Reverend Morris, a kindly man in his 60s who had ministered to the spiritual needs of Cedar Ridge for 20 years, conducted the ceremony with warmth and dignity. When he asked if Thomas took Eleanor to be his lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, till death do them part, Thomas said, "I do," with a firm, clear voice that carried through the small space. But inside, a voice whispered that the for poorer was coming in 4 months, that the for worse was guaranteed, that he was making these sacred vows knowing he was deceiving her about their immediate future. When Eleanor said her own "I do," her voice rang with conviction and joy, and Thomas felt the weight of his deception settle more heavily on his shoulders. They kissed at the Reverend's instruction, and the assembled witnesses smiled and applauded. Whatever doubts or judgments some might have harbored about their unconventional beginning seemed to melt away in the face of the obvious love between them. The celebration afterward was held at the ranch, with neighbors bringing food and drink, and making a party of it. Martha presided over everything from a chair Thomas had positioned carefully in the shade, accepting congratulations and well wishes, with the grace of a woman who had raised a daughter to be proud of. Eleanor danced with Thomas in the space between the house and the barn, laughing as he apologized for his lack of skill and stepped on her toes. "I don't care if you are the worst dancer in New Mexico," Eleanor told him, her arms around his neck and her face tilted up to his, "as long as you keep looking at me like that." "Like what?" Thomas asked, though the smile tugging at his mouth suggested he knew exactly what she meant. "Like I'm home," Eleanor said softly. "You are home," Thomas replied and kissed her again, to the hoots and hollers of their guests. That night, after the last well-wishers had departed and Martha had retired to her room with pointed commentary about being a heavy sleeper, Thomas and Eleanor stood together on the porch. The main bedroom was theirs now properly, and Eleanor felt nervous butterflies in her stomach despite the desire that had been building between them for weeks. Thomas seemed to sense her nervousness. He took her hand and pressed a kiss into her knuckles. "We don't have to rush anything. This is our life now. We have all the time in the world." But Eleanor shook her head, stepping closer to him. "I'm not afraid. Not of this. Not of you. I trust you, Thomas." The way his eyes darkened with desire and love made her feel powerful and feminine in a way that was entirely new. When he picked her up and carried her across the threshold into their bedroom, Eleanor laughed with pure happiness, burying her face in his shoulder and breathing in the scent of him that had become so familiar. What followed was tender and awkward and wonderful in the way of first times between people who loved each other. Thomas was patient and careful, and Eleanor was grateful for the marriage manuals she had read in secret back in Boston, the ones that had given her some idea of what to expect. But nothing had prepared her for the emotional intimacy of it, the vulnerability and trust required to give yourself to another person so completely, the sense of connection that went deeper than physical pleasure. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, and Eleanor felt contentment settle over her like a warm blanket. Thomas's hand traced lazy patterns on her shoulder, and she could hear his heartbeat strong and steady beneath her ear. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. "I love you too," Thomas replied, his voice rough with emotion. "Thank you for choosing me, for taking a chance on this life. Thank you for making room for both of us," Eleanor said, "for being exactly who you are." The words struck Thomas like a physical blow. For being exactly who you are. If she only knew that he was not who she thought, that the foundation of their marriage was built on lies he had still not confessed. He held her closer and told himself that tomorrow he would find a way to tell her. Tomorrow he would be honest. Tomorrow he would give her the truth she deserved. But tomorrow came and Thomas said nothing. The days turned to weeks, and still he remained silent about the debt and the foreclosure deadline that crept closer with each sunrise. Winter came early that year, hitting the territory with unusual severity. The first major snowstorm struck in mid-December, 3 weeks after the wedding. Snow fell for 2 days straight, piling into drifts that buried fence posts and made travel impossible. Thomas and Eleanor and Martha were trapped in the house together, forced into an intimacy that might have been uncomfortable, but instead deepened their bonds. They spent long evenings by the fire reading aloud from the few books Thomas owned and the ones Eleanor had brought from Boston. They played card games that Martha taught them, laughing when Thomas proved to be comically bad at poker despite his best efforts to bluff. They talked about everything and nothing, building the kind of easy companionship that was the bedrock of lasting marriages. But on the second day of the storm, Thomas's attention turned from domestic comfort to professional crisis. The cattle would be suffering in this weather, and he needed to check on them. Eleanor protested when she realized what he intended. "It's too dangerous. You can barely see 5 feet in this snow." "If I don't check, we could lose cattle," Thomas said, pulling on every layer of clothing he owned. "And we can't afford to lose any." The slip was small but significant. "We can't afford," she. Eleanor caught it, her eyes sharpening with attention, but she did not press the issue, not with Thomas preparing to go out into a blizzard. Thomas was gone for 4 hours. Eleanor spent that time standing at the window trying to peer through the white curtain of falling snow for any sign of him. Martha tried to distract her with sewing projects, but Eleanor's hands shook too badly to thread a needle. When Thomas finally stumbled back through the door, he was half frozen. His fingers were white with frostbite, his ears bright red and painful to touch. He was shaking so violently he could barely speak. Eleanor rushed to help him, stripping off his frozen outer layers and wrapping him in every blanket they owned. She warmed his hands carefully, knowing from books she had read that too rapid warming could cause permanent damage. Martha heated water for tea while Eleanor rubbed Thomas's feet and hands, trying to restore circulation. "I moved the cattle to the sheltered area near the creek," Thomas managed to say through chattering teeth. "But we lost 2 calves. They were too young, couldn't survive the cold." "The calves don't fatten," Eleanor said fiercely, tears streaming down her face. "You matter. Promise me you won't take risks like that again." "Can't promise that," Thomas said. "The cattle are our livelihood." "Cattle can be replaced," Eleanor said. "You can't." That night, holding Thomas as he shivered under every blanket they owned, Eleanor felt the depth of fear that came with loving someone. The terror of loss, the helplessness of being unable to protect someone from the dangers they chose to face. It was a sobering reminder that the life they were building came with real risks and real costs. January brought a different kind of storm, this one delivered by post rather than weather. A rider came to the ranch on a clear, cold morning, unusual enough that Eleanor went out to meet him. The man handed her a letter addressed to Thomas, with a return address that made her stomach tighten, with undefined worry. Cedar Ridge Bank. "Letter for Mr. Garrett," the writer said. "Bank asked me to deliver it personal." Eleanor thanked him and took the letter inside. Thomas was out checking fence lines damaged by the December storm. Eleanor stared at the envelope for a long moment, fighting the urge to open it. It was not addressed to her. She had no right. But the fact that the bank had sent a rider specifically to deliver it suggested urgency, importance, something Thomas needed to know immediately. When Thomas returned that afternoon, Eleanor met him at the door with the letter in her hand. "This came for you," she said, "from the bank." Thomas's face went carefully neutral, but Eleanor saw something flicker in his eyes. Fear, maybe, or guilt. "I'll look at it later," he said, taking the envelope and tucking it into his pocket without opening it. "Is everything all right?" Eleanor asked. "With the bank, I mean." "Just routine business," Thomas said, his voice determinedly casual. "Nothing to worry about." But Eleanor noticed that he did not open the letter in front of her, that he waited until he could be alone in the barn before breaking the seal and reading what it contained. She noticed, and she wondered, and she worried. Late that evening, after Eleanor had gone to bed, Martha sat by the fire with her sewing, working on a complicated piece of embroidery by lamplight. Thomas sat across from her, ostensibly reading, but his eyes had not moved from the same page in 20 minutes. "You're carrying something heavy, Mr. Garrett," Martha said without looking up from her work. Thomas started, slightly pulled from his thoughts. "Just ranch worries, Mrs. Bishop. Nothing unusual." Martha stopped sewing and looked at him directly. Her faded blue eyes held a sharpness that age had not diminished. "I've lived long enough to recognize when a man is burdened by more than weather and cattle," she said. "And I've seen how you look when Eleanor asks about supplies or money, like you're calculating something in your head that doesn't add up the way you need it to." Thomas said nothing, but he closed his book. "I don't know what troubles you're facing," Martha continued, "but I know my daughter loves you, and I know you're a good man. Whatever it is hiding, it won't make it better. It'll only make it worse when the truth comes out." And truth always comes out, Mr. Garrett. Always. What if the truth means losing everything? Thomas asked quietly. Martha considered this for a long moment before responding. Then you lose it together. That's what marriage is, facing the hard things as partners. But if you lose it while keeping secrets, you lose alone. And that's infinitely harder. She returned to her right phoning, leaving Thomas to sit with her words. They were wise words spoken from experience and love. Thomas knew she was right. He should tell Eleanor about the debt, about the foreclosure notice, about the lies he had told to bring her here. But knowing what he should do and having the courage to do it were two different things entirely. February arrived with deceptive mildness, the kind of weather that made men forget winter's harshness and believe spring might come early. Thomas rode into Cedar Ridge on a morning when the sun felt almost warm, but the lightness of the weather could not lift the weight pressing down on his chest. 6 weeks. He had 6 weeks before the bank's deadline. The ride to town took an hour, giving Thomas plenty of time to rehearse what he would say to Mr. Pemberton. He had $47 saved, scraped together from selling 3 cattle and from the income Martha's sewing had generated. It was not enough. It would never be enough. But perhaps it would demonstrate good faith. Perhaps Pemberton would grant another extension. Even as he thought it, Thomas knew it was false hope. The bank had already extended the deadline twice over the past 2 years. There would be no third extension. Cedar Ridge Bank occupied a sturdy brick building on the main street, one of the few permanent structures in a town still dominated by adobe and wood. Thomas tied his horse to the hitching post and stood for a moment, gathering courage before entering. Inside, the air smelled of paper and ink and the particular mustiness of ledgers and loan documents. Mr. Pemberton's office was in the back, separated from the main room by a door that was currently standing open. Pemberton was 53 years old, a precise man who wore spectacles and kept his desk obsessively organized. He looked up when Thomas entered, and something flickered across his face. Not surprise. He had been expecting this visit. Mr. Garrett, Pemberton said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. I assume you received our notice. I did, Thomas said, settling into the chair and holding his hat in his lap. I'm here to discuss options. Pemberton removed his spectacles and polished them with a handkerchief, a delaying tactic that told Thomas everything he needed to know before the banker spoke. There are no options, Mr. Garrett. Payment in full by March 15th or we foreclose. We've extended the deadline twice already. The board will not authorize a third extension. What if I could make a partial payment? Thomas asked, hearing the desperation in his own voice and hating it. Show good faith. I have $47. Pemberton's expression softened slightly, which somehow made everything worse. Pity was harder to bear than indifference. Mr. Garrett, $47 against a debt of $340 is not sufficient. I'm sorry, but we need full payment. No exceptions. Thomas felt the last of his hope crumble. I've got 47 head of cattle, a growing herd, good ranch operation. I just need more time. You've had time, Pemberton said, not unkindly but firmly. You borrowed this money 2 years ago to expand your herd. You lost most of those cattle in the winter of '77. You've been struggling ever since. And now you've taken on a wife and her mother. The mathematics simply don't work, Mr. Garrett. The silence that followed felt suffocating. Thomas stared at his hands, at the calluses and scars that represented 7 years of back-breaking work that was about to be taken from him. Unless, Pemberton said slowly, leaning back in his chair. Thomas looked up. Unless what? There's a man named Calhoun, operates out of Santa Fe. He facilitates certain arrangements. He buys debts from banks at a discount, then collects in his own ways. Understanding came slowly then, all at once. You want me to sell my debt to a loan shark? I'm saying it's an option, Pemberton replied carefully. He'd pay us $250 cash for your $340 debt. You'd still owe him $340, but he might be more flexible about repayment timeline. Flexible how? He accepts various forms of payment, labor, goods. Sometimes he employs men for jobs. Pemberton paused meaningfully. Not all of them strictly legal, but they pay well. The implication was clear. Calhoun was a criminal. His jobs likely involved rustling, smuggling, possibly worse. Working for him would mean compromising everything Thomas believed about himself. everything he had built his life around. But refusing meant losing the ranch, losing the home he had promised Eleanor, destroying the life they had just begun building together. I need to think about it, Thomas said finally. Don't think too long, Pemberton replied. Offer expires when your deadline does. After that, we foreclose and Calhoun loses interest. Thomas rode home in a fog of despair, barely aware of the landscape passing around him. 6 weeks to find $293 or compromise his integrity by working for a criminal. Those were his options. Both felt like different forms of failure. He arrived back at the ranch to find Eleanor hanging laundry on the line, taking advantage of the mild weather. She waved when she saw him, smiling in a way that made his chest ache with guilt and love in equal measure. That evening, while Thomas was still in town dealing with supplies, Eleanor was cleaning the main room when she found the ledger. It had fallen behind the small desk Thomas kept near the window, wedged between the desk and the wall, in a way that suggested it had been there for some time. Eleanor picked it up, intending simply to return it to its proper place. But it fell open in her hands, and her eyes caught on the numbers written in Thomas's careful hand. Debt amount $340. Original cattle count 47. The world seemed to tilt sideways. Eleanor sat down hard on the nearest chair, the ledger trembling in her hands. She turned pages, finding more calculations. Income projections that barely broke even. Expenses that exceeded income. And they're circled multiple times in what looked like angry pencil strokes. March 15th. Foreclosure, 6 weeks. They had 6 weeks before losing everything. And Thomas had never told her. The prosperous rancher was a lie. The 500 head of cattle was a lie. The established operation was a fiction created to lure a desperate woman west. Every letter, every assurance, every promise of security had been built on deception. Eleanor's hands shook as she continued reading. She found notes about selling cattle to raise money, desperate calculations trying to find a way to make the numbers work. If sell 20 cattle at $15 each equals $300, not enough, need $40 more. The mathematics of desperation laid bare on paper. Martha emerged from the smaller bedroom where she had been resting, took one look at Eleanor's face, and hurried over as quickly as her limited strength allowed. "What's wrong, dear?" Eleanor showed her the ledger wordlessly. Martha read silently, her expression growing more grave with each page. "He's been lying," Eleanor said, her voice barely above a whisper. "About everything. We have 6 weeks before we lose the ranch. 6 weeks, and he never told me." Martha closed the ledger and set it on the table. Her response was surprisingly calm. "Then we wait for him to come home, and we have an honest conversation. All three of us." "How can you be so calm?" Eleanor demanded, feeling tears of anger and betrayal burning behind her eyes. "He lied to us, Mama. He brought us here under false pretenses. We trusted him, and he lied." "Yes," Martha agreed. "He lied. And that was wrong. But Eleanor, we also know why he lied. Desperate people do desperate things. The question now is not what he did, but what we do about it." Thomas returned after dark, immediately sensing the changed atmosphere. Eleanor and Martha sat at the table, the ledger between them like an accusation. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows that made the small room feel like a courtroom. "We need to talk," Eleanor said, and Thomas heard the control in her voice, the hurt underneath. He saw the ledger and knew it was over. The pretense, the deception, everything he had tried to hide, all of it exposed. Thomas removed his hat and sat down across from them. "I can explain." "Then explain." Eleanor set her hazel eyes hard in a way he had never seen. "Explain why you told me you had a prosperous ranch when you're 6 weeks from foreclosure. Explain why you let me believe we had security when we have nothing. Explain why you married me without telling me the truth." The words Thomas had rehearsed, the careful explanations and justifications, all dissolved under the weight of her anger and hurt. What emerged instead was raw honesty. "I lied in the letters. I exaggerated the cattle count, made the ranch sound more established than it was. I did it because I was desperate and lonely, and I didn't think any woman would come for a failing rancher." He took a breath, forcing himself to continue. "When you arrived with your mother, I should have told you the truth then, but I was already committed to the lie. And then I saw how desperate you were too, how much you needed somewhere safe, and I couldn't turn you away. So you lied more," Eleanor said flatly. I told myself I'd make it work somehow, Thomas admitted. That I'd pay off the debt before you found out. That if I worked hard enough, the lie would become truth. But I was wrong. I should have told you before we married. I should have given you the choice. Instead, I made the choice for you. And that was unfair and dishonest, and I'm sorry. The silence that followed felt endless. Martha watched them both, her expression unreadable. The bank gave me an option today, Thomas continued, needing to tell them everything now that the dam had broken. There's a man named Calhoun who buys debts. He'd give me more time to pay, but his methods aren't honest. Might involve breaking the law, and I don't know what to do. Eleanor stood abruptly, pacing to the window and staring out into the darkness. Thomas watched her rigid back and felt his heart breaking. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but steady. How much do we owe? $340. And we have 47. Eleanor turned to face him. So we need $293 in 6 weeks. Thomas nodded, surprised by her shift from hurt to practicality. Can we sell cattle? I'd have to sell at least 20 head, Thomas said. That would leave us with less than 30 cattle. Not enough to support us long term. We'd be trading the future for the present. Martha spoke for the first time since Thomas's confession. How much have I made from sewing? Thomas looked at her in surprise. About $25 so far, Mrs. Bishop. Then I can make more, Martha said firmly. I'll work faster, take more down. And I can take on more students? Eleanor added, still looking at Thomas. Charge a small fee. I've been teaching for free, but families would pay something for proper instruction. Eleanor, Thomas said carefully, even if we combine everything, we can't make $293 in 6 weeks. The mathematics don't work. Eleanor returned to the table and sat down, leaning forward with an intensity that reminded Thomas why he had fallen in love with her. Then we find a way to make the mathematics work. But Thomas, we do it together, honestly. No more lies, no more secrets. If we're going to fail, we fail knowing the truth. If we're going to succeed, we succeed as partners. She held his gaze. Are we partners, Thomas, or am I just someone you made promises to that you can't keep? We're partners, Thomas said, his voice rough with emotion. If you still want to be, after everything I've lied about. I'm angry, Eleanor said. I'm hurt, but I'm not leaving. We made vows, for richer or for poorer. Turns out we're at poorer sooner than I expected, so we deal with it together. The relief Thomas felt was so profound, it left him weak. She was not leaving. Despite his lies, despite his failures, she was staying. Thank you, he whispered. Don't thank me yet, Eleanor said with a ghost of a smile. We still have to figure out how to save this ranch. The next morning, Martha was at her Singer machine before dawn. She had a plan, and she attacked it with the determination of a woman who had survived worse than financial crisis. She visited every client she had done work for, not asking for charity, but for opportunities. Advance payment for future work. Referrals to other people who needed sewing. Bigger jobs that paid better. Mrs. Henderson, the storekeeper's wife, welcomed Martha into her parlor with tea and sympathy. Mrs. Bishop, I heard through Reverend Morris that you might be facing difficulties. I have 3 dresses that need altering. I can pay in advance if that would help. That's very kind, Martha said carefully, but I'd rather earn it properly. I'll do the best work you've ever seen, and you can pay me when I deliver the finished pieces. Mrs. Henderson smiled. I know you will. But Mrs. Bishop, we all need help sometimes. You've become part of this community. We take care of our own. The pattern repeated across Cedar Ridge. Martha's skill and quiet dignity had earned respect. People wanted to help, and they found ways to do it that preserved her pride. She returned to the ranch that evening with $40 in advance payment and enough work lined up to make another $30 if she worked fast. Eleanor took a different approach. She went to the families whose children she had been teaching and proposed expanding the school. More hours, more subjects, but with a small fee of $2 per month per student. Most families agreed immediately. Education was valuable, worth paying for. But some parents offered alternatives. Mr. Wilson, a rancher whose son attended Eleanor's classes, scratched his head thoughtfully. Mrs. Garrett, I can't spare much cash, but I can give you 2 hogs and a dozen chickens, trade for my boy's education for the rest of the year. Eleanor calculated quickly. 2 hogs were worth at least $10. A dozen laying hens, another 5. That's more than fair, Mr. Wilson. Thank you. The barter economy activated. Families traded goods and services for education. Within a week, Eleanor had generated $15 in cash and $25 worth of goods. More importantly, she had demonstrated to the community that the Garretts were working to solve their problems, not just accepting charity. Thomas's response to the community help was complicated. Gratitude mixed with humiliation. This was his debt, his failure. He should fix it alone. Jack Crawford confronted him about it while they were repairing fence damaged by winter storms. Boss, stop being a stubborn fool. People are offering help because they care, because they respect you. Accept it with grace. It's charity, Jack, Thomas said, driving a fence post into hard ground with more force than necessary. No, it's community, Jack corrected. There's a difference. You helped build this town. You served on the volunteer fire brigade last summer. You helped raise Rodriguez's barn when fire took his. You think people forgot that? Now it's your turn to accept help. That's how community works. The words struck home, though Thomas's pride still rebelled against them. Reverend Morris visited the ranch a few days later, his kind face serious but compassionate. Thomas, I heard about your situation. The church has a discretionary fund for members in need. We can contribute $50. Thomas started to protest, but the Reverend held up a hand. It's not charity. It's what the fund is for. And the Lord knows you've given plenty to the church over the years. Time to let the community give back. Over the next 6 weeks, Thomas and Eleanor and Martha worked with a desperation born of necessity, but sustained by hope. Thomas sold 12 cattle, carefully choosing which ones to part with to minimize long-term damage to the herd. He raised $180. Martha worked 16-hour days at the Singer machine, her fingers cramping with arthritis but refusing to stop. She completed 8 major jobs and numerous smaller repairs. She raised $45. Eleanor taught morning and afternoon sessions 6 days a week, her voice growing hoarse from constant instruction. She raised $20 in cash and $30 worth of goods. Neighbors hired Thomas for jobs. Wilson needed fence repair, $15. Henderson wanted help with barn work, $10. Rodriguez needed horses broken, $25. Everyone knew Thomas needed money, and they found ways to help while preserving his dignity. By the first week of March, they had $325, still $15 short. Thomas considered selling his saddle, worth perhaps $10. His rifle, worth $15, but necessary for hunting. They were running out of things to sell, out of time, out of options. On March 13th, 2 days before the deadline, Jack Crawford appeared at the ranch carrying an envelope. Got something for you, boss, he said, holding it out. Thomas opened it to find $20 in bills. He looked up at Jack in confusion. Ain't from me, Jack said quickly. It's from the hands. Me, Pete Morrison, the Rodriguez brothers, who worked here last summer, Johnson, who you helped with branding. We all pitched in. Call it back wages you never quite paid us properly. We're just settling accounts. It was a lie, and both men knew it. Thomas had always paid fair wages. This was charity disguised as debt payment, one last kindness from men who understood pride. Thomas's eyes stung, though he refused to let tears fall. Thank you, Jack. Tell the others, thank you. You can tell them yourself when you keep this place, Jack said gruffly, turning to leave before emotion could overcome either of them. On March 15th, Thomas rode to Cedar Ridge with $345 in cash carefully wrapped and secured in his saddlebag. He had saved an extra $5 as a buffer, unwilling to risk being even a penny short. In Pemberton's office, Thomas counted out the bills. $340 exactly. The banker watched in silence, then stamped the necessary papers. Debt paid in full, Pemberton said, sliding the ranch deed across the desk. Property clear of all encumbrances. You're free of it, Mr. Garrett. Thomas took the deed, the paper feeling both weightless and impossibly heavy. Thank you, Mr. Pemberton. Don't thank me, the banker said. And Mr. Garrett, don't borrow against this property again. I won't be able to help you next time. There won't be a next time, Thomas promised. I learned my lesson. He rode home with the clear deed in his pocket, feeling lighter than he had in 2 years. But he was also aware that while the financial debt was paid, he now carried a different kind of debt, one of honor and gratitude to a community that had saved him when he could not save himself. Eleanor and Martha were waiting on the porch when he arrived. Thomas held up the deed, unable to speak past the emotion clogging his throat. It's ours, he finally managed. Free and clear. Eleanor flew down the steps and into his arms, laughing and crying at once. Ours, not yours, ours. That night, the three of them sat together at the table that had witnessed so much pain and honesty over the past months. We've learned something important through this, Martha said, her weathered hands folded on the table. Hardship reveals character, and support reveals community. And honesty, even when it's hard, is the foundation of marriage. Eleanor added, looking at Thomas. I'm sorry I lied, Thomas said, meeting her eyes directly. To both of you, I was trying to protect my pride and ended up nearly destroying everything. We move forward from here, Eleanor said firmly. New foundation, built on truth. Spring arrived with the urgency of life too long suppressed. The cottonwoods along the creek burst into green. Wildflowers carpeted the valley in colors that seemed impossible after the stark winter. The cattle lean from sparse winter grazing began to put on weight as new grass emerged. With the debt cleared, Thomas could invest in improvements. He repaired the leaking roof properly instead of patching it temporarily. He bought 6 more cattle, beginning the slow work of rebuilding the herd. He and Eleanor planted a larger garden, her enthusiasm for growing things infectious. Martha's health had plateaued but remained stable. She worked reasonable hours now, no longer killing herself with 16-hour days. The fear that had driven her sowing frenzy had eased, replaced by contentment in her work and pride in what they had accomplished together. Eleanor's school thrived. 15 students attended regularly, and she had become an institution in Cedar Ridge. Parents spoke of Mrs. Garrett with respect, grateful for the education their children received. The marriage deepened in ways that crisis and confession had made possible. Every Sunday evening, the three of them reviewed ranch finances together. Complete transparency. Eleanor knew exactly what they had, what they owed, what they could afford. No more secrets. Thomas discovered that partnership meant sharing burdens, not carrying them alone. When decisions needed to be made, he consulted Eleanor. Her perspective, shaped by education and different experiences, often revealed solutions he had not considered. And Eleanor taught Thomas to read more fluently. He could read but not well, and he had been embarrassed by his limitations. She worked with him patiently, and he found joy in books that had previously been frustrating struggles. In late summer, Eleanor discovered she was pregnant. The news brought joy mixed with practical concerns. They would need to expand the house. A baby required space supplies preparation. Thomas's response after the initial shock and happiness faded was characteristic. We need to build an addition. The baby needs a proper room. We can't afford it. Eleanor started to say, then stopped herself. Can we afford it? They sat down with the ledger calculating carefully. With the debt cleared and income from cattle sales, sewing work, and Eleanor's teaching, they could manage it. Barely, but they could manage. We can't afford not to, Thomas corrected. This is our future, our legacy. The community came together again, this time in celebration rather than crisis. Neighbors helped Thomas build the addition, 2 new bedrooms and a larger kitchen. The house doubled in size, transforming from a bachelor's cabin into a proper family home. In March 1880, Eleanor went into labor. Mrs. Chen, the territory's most respected midwife, had been staying at the ranch for the final 2 weeks of Eleanor's pregnancy. When the contractions started, she took charge with calm efficiency, shooing Thomas out of the room and enlisting Martha as her assistant. The labor was long and difficult. Thomas paced outside like a caged animal, wearing a path in the dirt as he walked back and forth. He could hear Eleanor's cries through the walls, each one a knife to his heart. He had never felt so helpless, unable to do anything to ease her suffering. When the baby's cry finally pierced the air, thin and wailing and perfect, Thomas sagged against the wall in relief. Mrs. Chen emerged minutes later, wiping her hands on her apron and smiling. You have a son, a healthy boy with a good set of lungs. Mother and baby are both doing well. Thomas did not remember crossing the threshold, but suddenly he was kneeling beside the bed where Eleanor lay, exhausted but radiant. She held a tiny bundle in her arms, and when she looked up at him, her eyes shone with tears and triumph. Look, she whispered, look at what we made. Thomas looked down at his son. The impossibly small face was scrunched up in displeasure at being thrust into the cold world. The baby had a shock of dark hair, and tiny, perfect fingers curled into fists. As Thomas watched, one of those miniature hands reached out blindly. Without thinking, Thomas offered his finger. The baby's grip was surprisingly strong, and Thomas felt something fundamental shift inside his chest. "He's perfect," Thomas said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "You're perfect. Thank you, Eleanor. Thank you for this gift." They named him William Marcus Garrett, honoring both their fathers. William from the start, though Martha occasionally called him Billy when she thought no one was listening. He was a good baby, healthy and alert, transforming their lives in ways both expected and surprising. The house that had seemed adequately sized suddenly felt cramped, with a cradle in the bedroom, and drying diapers hung everywhere. The nights were broken by feedings and changings, and Eleanor walked through the days in a fog of exhausted love. Thomas proved to be a devoted father in ways that surprised even Eleanor. He took his turns walking the floor with a fussy baby without complaint. He changed diapers with the same matter-of-fact competence he brought to ranch work. He fashioned a cradle board similar to the ones Apache mothers used, allowing Eleanor to keep William close while she worked. The sight of her husband, this strong, capable rancher, cradling their tiny son with such gentleness, never failed to make Eleanor's heart swell with love. Martha was besotted with her grandson, spending hours rocking him and singing old lullabies Eleanor remembered from her own childhood. The baby seemed to recognize his grandmother's voice, settling immediately when she took him in her arms. It gave Martha new purpose, this grandmothering, and her face carried a contentment that spoke of a life lived fully. As William grew from infant to toddler, the ranch prospered in ways Thomas had only dreamed during those desperate years. His herd increased to 120 head. He hired 2 permanent ranch hands, Jack Crawford and a young man named Pete Morrison, creating stable employment for men who needed it. Eleanor's informal school became formalized. In 1887, the community built a larger schoolhouse and agreed to pay Eleanor a salary. Her curriculum expanded beyond basic reading and writing to include history, geography, and the natural sciences she loved. Her students went on to become teachers themselves, business owners, ranchers who improved on their parents' methods. They always credited Mrs. Garrett with giving them the foundation for their success. 2 years after William's birth, Eleanor gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl they named James Marcus and Sarah Catherine, honoring both Thomas's father and Eleanor's mother. The delivery was harder than William's had been, with complications that left everyone terrified. The first baby James delivered without incident, but Sarah was breech, requiring Mrs. Chen to turn her manually while Eleanor screamed in pain that could be heard across the ranch. Thomas tried to burst into the room, but Jack physically restrained him. "Let the midwife work, boss," Jack said, holding Thomas back with surprising strength for a man with a game leg. "She knows what she's doing." When Sarah finally emerged, small and angry and alive, Eleanor lay in bed with a baby in each arm, tears streaming down her exhausted face. "We're going to need a bigger house," Thomas said, looking somewhat dazed as he surveyed his suddenly expanded family. "We are," Eleanor agreed, laughing through her exhaustion, "and possibly more help." They hired a young woman named Sarah Mitchell to help with the children and household work. The house expanded again, growing with the family it sheltered. Martha lived to see all 3 grandchildren grow past toddlerhood, her heart finally giving out peacefully in her sleep when she was 74 years old. They buried her on a rise overlooking the ranch, in a spot she had always loved for its view of the mountains. Eleanor grieved deeply, but there was comfort in knowing her mother had spent her final years in happiness and purpose, surrounded by family who loved her. "She got to start over here," Eleanor said at the funeral, standing between Thomas and 8-year-old William, who was trying to be brave. "She got to build a new life, one that was full of joy instead of struggle. That's all any of us can hope for." The years continued to unfold, bringing the normal mix of triumphs and sorrows that make up a life. There were hard winters and drought summers, cattle lost to disease and crops that failed. There were injuries and illnesses, close calls that left Thomas and Eleanor clinging to each other in relief. But there were also first days of school and birthday celebrations, holidays spent with friends and neighbors who had become family, quiet evenings on the porch watching their children play. The simple joys that accumulate into a life well lived. William grew into a serious young man who loved the ranch as much as his father did. James was more interested in books and learning, eventually going east to law school and returning to open a practice in Cedar Ridge. Sarah was a perfect blend of both parents, practical and idealistic in equal measure, with her mother's passion for teaching and her father's steady determination. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Thomas took Eleanor back to the overlook where he had proposed. They were older now, marked by 2 decades of hard work and sun and the inevitable passage of time. Thomas's hair was streaked with gray, and Eleanor's hands bore calluses from years of labor. But when they looked at each other, they saw not just what was, but all that had been, the accumulation of 20 years of shared experiences and grown love. "I would do it all again," Eleanor said, sitting on the same rock where they had sat so many years before. "Every hard moment, every challenge. It was all worth it to end up here with you. Even the part where I lied about everything and nearly lost the ranch," Thomas asked, though his tone was gentle, the old wound long since healed into a scar they could touch without pain. "Especially that part," Eleanor said seriously, "because that's when I truly understood who you were. Not when you wrote pretty letters or made promises from a distance, but when you were faced with failure and chose honesty even though it cost you everything. That's when our real marriage began." Thomas pulled her close and they sat together watching the sun set just as they had 2 decades earlier. The land spread out below them was dotted with their cattle, and they could see the ranch house in the distance, smoke rising from the chimney where their children were probably helping Sarah Mitchell prepare dinner. "My home has room for both," Thomas said softly, echoing the words that had changed everything. "Best decision I ever made." "Best decision we both made," Eleanor corrected and kissed him as the sky turned gold and pink and purple, painting them in light. The years that followed were kinder than either had any right to expect. William took over more of the ranch operations as Thomas's joints began to protest the long hours. James's law practice helped bring order and justice to a territory transitioning to statehood. Sarah's school educated the children of families who had once been taught by their grandmother. Thomas and Eleanor grew old together, their love deepening and mellowing like good wine. They became the couple that younger people pointed to as an example. The mail-order bride and the cowboy who had built something beautiful out of an uncertain beginning. They became grandparents and then great-grandparents, their family tree spreading and branching until they could barely keep track of all their descendants. And on that spring evening in 1970, when Thomas finished telling the story to his great-grandson Daniel, the sun had fully set and stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Daniel sat in silence for a long moment, processing everything he had heard. Finally, he spoke. "So you lied to Grandma Eleanor, and the ranch almost got foreclosed, but you made it work." "That's the simplified version," Thomas agreed. "But yes, why are you telling me this now before I ship out to Vietnam?" Thomas looked at his great-grandson, directly seeing in the young man's face echoes of William of Eleanor, of all the generations that had come from that desperate decision in September 1878. "Because you need to know several things before you go. First, honesty isn't about never making mistakes. It's about owning them when you do. I lied to your grandmother, that was wrong. But when I was caught, I didn't make excuses. I confessed fully and worked to make it right. That's what matters." Thomas paused, making sure Daniel was listening. "Second, pride will kill you if you let it. I almost lost everything because I couldn't admit I needed help. Don't make that mistake. When you're in trouble, and you will be in trouble in that jungle, ask for help. From your squad, from your commanding officer, from anyone who can assist. There's no shame in needing help. Third, community matters. I couldn't save this ranch alone. It took an entire town. In war, you'll need your brothers beside you. Trust them, support them, let them support you. Fourth, when you make promises, mean them. I promised your grandmother that my home had room for both of them. Keeping that promise cost everything I had, but it was worth it. Because from that promise came your grandmother's happiness, came your father, came you. Good promises are worth any cost." Thomas's voice grew softer. "Fifth, the woman you love deserves truth, all of it, even when it's ugly, especially when it's ugly. If you find someone you want to marry, and I hope you do when you come back, tell her the truth from the beginning. Don't make my mistakes. Finally, legacy isn't what you own. It's what you build. I built this ranch from nothing, boss. It saved it, built it again. Your grandfather expanded it. You'll do something with it too when you return. But the ranch itself isn't the legacy." Thomas gestured to the land spreading before them. "Legacy is the choices you make, the character you show, the community you build. Vietnam will test you, Daniel. Test your courage, your character, your honesty, your compassion. When it does, remember that you come from a line of people who faced impossible situations and found a way through. Not by being perfect, by being honest, asking for help, and keeping promises even when it cost everything. You're a Garrett. That means something. Not because of this land or money, because of character. Daniel stood preparing to leave. He would ship out in the morning. Thank you, Grandpa Thomas, for the story, for the truth. Thomas reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper yellowed with age. He handed it to Daniel, who unfolded it carefully. It was the ranch deed dated March 15th, 1879. Debt paid in full. This is the deed to the ranch. Paid off on that date. See it? Daniel examined the paper reverently. That's the date I kept my promise to your grandmother. My home has room for both. That home still stands, built on a foundation of honesty, hard-won, and community freely given. When you come back from Vietnam, and you will come back, this deed will still be here. This ranch will still be here. Your family will still be here. Thomas's voice was firm despite his 92 years. That's a promise, and Garretts keep their promises. Daniel embraced his great-grandfather, the old man's frame thin but still strong beneath his hands. I'll come back, I promise. Now see that you do, Thomas said. I'm too old to wait around forever. Daniel drove away in the morning, and Thomas watched from the porch until the dust from his truck disappeared. Then he looked out at the ranch spreading below, 160 acres that had nearly been lost but was saved. Not by one man's strength, but by a community's support and one woman's forgiveness. Eleanor had been gone 5 years now, died peacefully in 1965 with Thomas holding her hand, but he still felt her presence here in every corner of the house they had built together, in the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carried forward their legacy. The mail-order bride who had shown up with her mother. The cowboy who had said, my home has room for both. The lies that nearly destroyed them. The truth that saved them. The community that carried them. The legacy that endures. Thomas whispered to Eleanor's memory, to the land, to himself. We kept our promises, Eleanor, all of them. The easy ones and the hard ones, the ones that cost everything. And it was worth it. Every bit of it was worth it. The sun climbed higher in the sky, warming the porch and the old man who sat there. The same sun that had risen over this land for 92 years of Thomas's life. The same sun that would rise long after he was gone, watching over the legacy built not on lies or land, but on the simple, profound truth that sometimes the best things in life begin with the courage to say yes when reason says no, and the strength to tell the truth when lies would be easier. And somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed, and the wind moved through the cottonwoods, and life continued in the rhythms that had sustained this ranch and this family for nearly a century. The promise kept, the legacy secured, the story told so that the next generation might understand what it truly means to be a Garrett.